Solcito, solcito, solcito mío. Solcito, solcito, solcito mío. Solcito, solcito.
Good evening, good evening. Thank you for joining us today on Zoom, on Facebook Live. This event is made possible by the Human Relations Commission of the City of Boulder and by our general operating funders and sponsors. While we are all joining from the comfort of our own homes, we do want to acknowledge that the City of Boulder stands on the land of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute. Before we begin, I want to honor that many of us are struggling due to COVID-19, racism, and health and economic fears, as well as grieving the Sand Creek Massacre and its legacy. Let's take 3 collective deep breaths while we reflect in our mind on something we're each grateful for. Ready? Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. One last time. Inhale. Exhale. Thank you. Thank you for doing that with me. My name is Tanaya Winder. I am an undocumented immigrant. I'm a monologuist in Motus Theater's Undocu America series and the National Outreach and Education Director for Modus, where we create original theater to facilitate dialogue on critical issues of our time. We use the power of art to build alliances across diverse segments of our community. On November 29th, 1864, the founders of Boulder and other Colorado officials participated in the Sand Creek Massacre. We have an opportunity to come together exactly 156 years later to face this history and reflect on how we can create a more equitable future. Today, we will be screening part 1 of Motus Theater's award-winning Rocks, Karma, Arrows film, which explores the Sand Creek Massacre with a focus on how this history is woven into the founding of Boulder, Colorado. Motus Theater's artistic director, featured in the film, premiered Rocks, Karma, Arrows in 2009 at the Black Box Theater at Atlas at CU Boulder as part of an official event of the Boulder's sesquicentennial, while an artist in residence at CU. Over 2,000 people saw this performance live, and it has been credited with changes in Boulder as diverse as the momentum behind Indigenous Peoples Day to the push to diversify boards and commissions in Boulder. Part 1 is 60 minutes long and was never meant to be shown without part 2 of Rocks, Karma, Arrows, because it is painful to end this piece at the devastating moment of the Sand Creek Massacre. But after today's part 1, we're having a discussion and reflections with poet Tanaya Winder from Southern Ute, Pyramid Lake Paiute, and Duckwater Shoshone Nations, author of Sheep Left Hand Margaret Coel, and Dallin Maybee from NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, which is the oldest and largest nonprofit national Indian rights organization in the country. So we can watch part 1 and strategize to transform the pain of the Sand Creek Massacre into momentum towards Indigenous rights. Because this piece is not about creating guilt, our artistic director, Kirsten, likes to remind viewers that none of you were alive 156 years ago. You did not pull the triggers. But the violence of this history and the profound injustice continues into the present if we don't decide to take action and become part of the solution. Already, by learning this history of Boulder and Colorado and supporting NARF, you are already becoming part of the answer. We will begin with Tanaya Winder offering part 1 of her poetic response to Rocks, Karma, Arrows to open our hearts and minds to a spirit of deep inquiry. After the film, we will hear the second part of her poetic response, and then finally, after the Q&A, her powerful poem, Resistance.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you everybody for sharing space with us tonight. I look forward to sharing this space and learning together. As it says, I'm Tanaya. I run an Upward Bound program at UC Boulder, so I've been living in Boulder for 11 years now, and I'm going to share this poem that's broken up into 2 parts, and it kind of just comes after my reflections watching this play as well in the same format that you're going to watch it and just sitting with it for a little bit. And here's what transpired. So this is part 1. There's a call coming. Can you hear it? It's not quite ringing, but maybe buzzing in your ear. It's that feeling when something is off, not quite right, like something is missing. Did you lose your keys or misplace your dreams? Forget to unplug the coffee pot or turn off the lights? It's something. Something is not quite right, but you can't identify it. This feeling, this call. Maybe it's a part of you or your purpose, something you didn't quite notice at first, but it's so big it almost makes you nervous. Because why? Why add on another task to your to-do list, another cause to your existence? After all, you've already got your bliss and a good life. You're not responsible to anyone but you and your own. Shh, there's a call coming. Can you hear it? It's that feeling in your gut when you know you forgot something. You forgot something. Or is it something else? That's what a recent CNN poll called us when referring to Native Americans. Something else. I heard it, heard those words echo through every bone in my body and the history I wasn't taught in school. But wait, this is supposed to be about you and not me. And there's a call coming for you, and I'm supposed to help you to be ready to answer.
Thank you. And now, part 1 of Motus Theater's Rock Karma Arrows film.
Library. It was pressing up against the pedestrian bridge, threatening its structure, so they cut it down. This tree was pretty old, about 100 years. It's a lot of the history that we're going to talk about tonight, and a lot more that we will never, ever know. All we're going to perform tonight is a very small piece on a very large piece of Boulder history. A Boulder history in its nearness. For example, when they broke ground and dug the hole that became this theater on January 25th, 2005. These last rings here right below the bark. And this performance is about history in its farness. The history that happened long ago when this tree was just a sapling growing by the creek and other large trees ruled the canopy. And before this type of willow tree was even found in this region, and instead native trees, ponderosa pines and cottonwoods, and native peoples dominated the region. And this performance is a bit about the history that happened once upon a time. That history we love to celebrate that never really happened that way. Places, places! So this performance is about everything that is past, is dust, is dirt, is dead, is trash, is compost out of which the future rises. It started back in 2005 from a rock in my shoe, a broken piece of a boulder, something that kept irritating me when I was reading about yet another hate crime story in the paper. and listening to my friends at Naropa and CU talk about their experiences of racism in the community and wondering what this has to do with me. I mean, why is racism happening in Boulder? And how am I actually accountable to what is happening around me? How am I accountable to history in its nearness and in its farness? And of course, being a Naropa alum, I thought it was important to ask the good, engaged Buddhist question,
how can I be more skillful in the present moment to create a more equitable and enlightened society? And therefore, this piece has a lot to do with you as well as me. The direction we choose, the aim of our lives. It has a lot to do with arrows. To help me with this exploration are some members of the CU, Naropa, Boulder, and Denver communities. Film footage of the Boulder Creek shot by Rebecca West. So much of Boulder history literally runs along this stream. Historic newspapers, books on history, slides, and some interviews that I conducted with local historians.
My name is Modupe Labode, and I'm working as the chief historian at the Colorado Historical Society. But in this interview, I'll be expressing my opinions, as opposed to the opinions of the CHS.
Modupe Labode has a doctorate in history from Oxford.
Why I got into history? Oh my God.
That's Judy Mativi Morley. She has a PhD specializing in Western history from the University of New Mexico and teaches at the University of Colorado at Denver.
When I publish, I use Mativi. I don't use it in everyday conversation because it's a mouthful, but any articles I've written in both my books have Mativi.
Researching the book during the time that I was on the Boulder City Council was a tremendous educational experience because so many themes in Boulder's history are still the themes today.
So many themes in Boulder's history are still the themes today.
And this is Dan Corson, a local Boulder historian. He and a colleague, Tom Noel, wrote that book, Boulder County and Illustrated History. And that's Tani Saro Biku, the abbot of the Metaforest Monastery. He's out in California, so I interviewed him over the phone about skillful means in relationship to past and to present. Hello?
The issues of karma are so complex.
Part of the reason I got interested in history was, I think all people ask why. Why? Why is something this way? And I saw history as a way to get access to that why. I don't think it answers very much because, I just don't. I resist the idea of having a conclusion in history that this is the way it actually was. I do think there are some elements of truth that a historian has a responsibility to uncover and acknowledge. But I also think that any illusion that you can have the whole, that somehow you can go back and get a whole, very stable piece, is a fantasy. No more than how we can have a whole piece right now.
Cut! That's Pearl and 13th Street in 1866. Just 7 years after Boulder was founded. That is the same corner about 12 years later. This is a picture of Leopold de Backer's home at 75th and Arapahoe in the early 1860s. The de Backer family still live in Boulder. That's looking northwest from 14th and Walnut in 1876. This is CU in 1886, taken from 9th Street.
CU at that time consisted of Old Main and the President's House. CU had been founded just 12 years earlier, and the fact that Boulder got CU instead of the state penitentiary,
Yes, that was second prize.
was credited to the political maneuverings of David Nichols, Boulder County Territorial Legislature.
Slide. That's the junction of Broadway and 14th looking southwest. This is looking northwest from the old courthouse in the 1880s. That big building on the bottom right in the foreground is the lumberyard and mill that became the site of the Boulderado Hotel in 1909. That's Mapleton Avenue in 1895. Notice the new maple saplings. That's a panorama of Boulder and University campus in 1894. Sunset Hill at Bluff and 19th in 1925. That is just down the hill at Pearl and 11th in the 1890s, where old Chicago is now. These photos reveal a radically different landscape than appeared to the native peoples for hundreds and even thousands of years. Before 1859, there was no town. The Euro-Americans who came through just kept moving. Then 4 months after the Aikens party lands in Boulder, just 4 months, there is a town, plots of land sold, and we have Boulder City. So to begin with, Madupe, could you tell us whose land this was before it became Boulder?
Well, on one level, Niwot, or Left Hand as he was also called, was there when these gold seekers came.
Could one of the actors please come out and play Niwot and all in white so we can project on you?
Most people in Boulder know Chief Niwot through his legendary curse on the Boulder Valley.
People, seeing the beauty of this valley, will want to stay. And their staying will be the undoing of the beauty.
Research, did Niwot actually say that?
Let
No.
me see. No. Niwot was one of the peace chiefs of the Southern Arapaho. There are no pictures of him, but he was described by Mrs. Julia Lambert, a writer at that time, as
one of the finest looking Indians I've ever seen. Over 6 feet tall with a muscular build. He looked every inch a chief.
All right, cut on Lambert, thank you.
Niwot became a chief of his band in part because he spoke English. His older sister had married John Poisel, a white trader, and that allowed him to communicate directly with the American leaders.
So Madupe, if you were saying in recent times, would you say this is Arapaho land?
Well, we know that the Arapaho and Ute were in huge conflicts, and the Ute were all over here. And the Arapaho came in a little bit later, so you know it probably was Ute land before that. But anyone could categorically say it's American Indian lands, but which nation?
The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie promises the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Indians the land north of the Arkansas River and east of the Rocky Mountains.
I was at this treaty signing. I was not a chief at this time, so I did not sit in circle with the Americans, but I had almost all of their words in my mouth, for I translated for our people, as well as for the Cheyenne. And I saw the Americans make the mark that promised this land.
Research this land?
Yes.
And all of Boulder County.
To our people, forever.
These are two Arapaho boys, sons of Sharpnose, who posed for this photo at the end of the 19th century.
Things changed dramatically in this region when in July of 1858, gold was discovered at Cherry Creek, near where downtown Denver is today.
Gold!
This sparks the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, which brings an estimated 100,000 fortune hunters to the Rockies under the banner Pikes Peak or Bust.
Every white person in the world must be crossing through here. Our hunting grounds have been depleted.
If you look closely at the boys' arms and ribs, you can see the landscape of their battle with hunger.
It was Niwot's band of Southern Arapaho that were returning to their winter camp along the Boulder Creek when they discovered a group of 15 prospectors led by
Captain Thomas A. Aikens.
That's Boulder's founder, Thomas Aikens.
The Aikens party had come from out east, many from Maryland, following the gold rush, and arrived in the Boulder area in October of 1858.
Gold!
Niwot told the Aikens party in English to their astonishment.
Go away. You come to kill our game, burn our wood, and destroy our grass.
The Aikens party promised Niwot they were not planning on settling, but would leave for the mountains in the spring to search for gold.
Gold!
Some of Niwot's warriors, perceiving possible danger from these trespassers, encouraged an attack. But Niwot had seen other bands who came in conflict with the whites hunted to extinction. So for the good of his whole band, he chose to stand up against the angered warriors and assured the Aikens party their safety.
The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie promises the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Indians the land north of the Arkansas River and east of the Rocky Mountains.
When the white settlers came and set up what was at first a camp at Boulder Creek, it was really a day-by-day decision.
They cannot take the winter, and they will leave.
Do Niwot and his band make war on these people in order to get them out?
They will stay only one season.
Well, you know, Niwot had seen more and more people pass through here.
They will leave. They promised that they would leave in the spring.
Rather than risk war, it's kind of an appeasement policy.
We barely have enough warriors to hunt. If we attack these people, it could bring the entire cavalry of Denver down on us. And they promised that they would leave.
On January 16th, 1859, the Aikens party discovers gold in Gold Run near Gold Hill.
Gold!
They never leave. Instead, on February 10th, 1859, just 4 months after arriving at the creek, the Aikens party founds the Boulder City Town Company. And within a few weeks, the one-time camp of 11 cabins expanded to 70 permanent dwellings spread along today's Pearl Street.
That's a drawing of Boulder just 17 years after the town was founded, a place that is already recognizable as the place we live today. The city council even named Arapaho Street Not Yet Avenue in 1859.
Then pretty soon more white settlers come. The town gets bigger. Now Niwot has a different set of decisions to make because now the Arapaho are totally overpowered.
Do I join together with Hosa and the other tribes from the south to try to force them out?
That's Hosa, principal chief of the Southern Arapaho.
Do I try and speak with their leaders again to have our treaty honored?
And for Niwot, it's accommodation after accommodation after accommodation.
Colorado's early settlement in the 1860s and 70s was accompanied by increasing intolerance for those who were different. It was around the time of Manifest Destiny, so there's an idea that white Americans, white Christian Americans, should dominate the land and its people. Those who couldn't get with that idea did not deserve to be on the land. It's kind of scary to read about the celebration of homicides to solve problems in the 1860s, largely saying the Ute must go, the Arapaho must go, the Cheyenne must go. And when people said that, they weren't saying that they should move. It meant that they should be killed.
I asked the historians how Aikens could establish a town on land that by United States treaty belonged to the Arapaho and Cheyenne.
The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie promises the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Indians the land north of the Arkansas River and east of the Rocky Mountains.
Judy, was there some kind of legal process?
Well, yes and no. Yes, there was a process. You could stake a claim. And there were exceptions to the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I mean, you could find exceptions to the treaty. One famous one here in Denver. The founders of the Denver City Town Company got this old mountain man named William McGaw, who was married to a Cheyenne woman, and made him one of the investors in the town company. Well, by United States law, anything that belongs to the wife belongs to the husband. She was a member of the Cheyenne tribe, so she automatically gave her rights to that land to her husband, who then turned it over to his partners, the Denver City Town Company. Well, that's one loophole used here in Denver. Not the same loophole used in Boulder, but very similar. It was one where, well, you know, I hate to sound so obvious, but
possession is 9/10 of the law.
So if you squat, it's yours. But of course, that's something, if people did it today, you can't just go set up a tent out in a park. People would say, we're a nation of law. You can't do that.
No, Boulder Anti-Camping Ordinance, Chapter 5, Section 6, Paragraph 10.
But that's how people got the land in the so-called nonviolent land seizures. That's what people were doing.
So the site where Boulder actually sits isn't where the Arapaho and the Cheyenne really camped.
So Aikens could legally squat at the creek because...
The Arapaho camped a little farther north, up by Valmont Butte.
Oh yeah, the land right above the Stasio ball field.
It's not until 1864, when Sand Creek comes, that technically the white settlers in the area are staying here illegally. Trespassers. And when the Indians, mainly in the Denver settlements, begin to rise up and protest this, Sand Creek comes. So it's kind of extra legal that Boulder is being founded up there.
Extra legal?
Yes, and really thanks to the accommodation of Niwot and his people, until the whites totally overpower and outnumber them, and, well, then you have Sand Creek.
I think at the very least, there's a responsibility for remembrance. And that's very, very difficult, because it means thinking that as you walk along the creek, or if you're looking at the mountains, saying, these mountains belonged in fairly recent times to somebody else. That part of why we're here is through colonialism or manifest destiny, even though you or I or somebody walking down the street might feel completely innocent of that. We are historical products in many ways.
Hello?
The issues of karma are so complex. Reflect on the fact that all who are born into the human race have unskillful karma. So, as you're meditating, realize that you're not doing this just for yourself. You're doing it for the good of the world. And you want to do it well, so it can be helpful for other people, too.
People were forcibly erased and forced to move. And there was violence that was part of that. And we don't want to think about that because it hurts. But I think having some of that pain or that kind of, it's like having a rock in your shoe in this case. We're speaking English here as opposed to any other language.
Cut.
No one knows historically why at Boulder's first city council meeting, they set forth a list of land use regulations unheard of for a rugged western settlement. I mean, absolutely unheard of. They determined at that time that cabin walls had to be higher than 8 1/2 feet, with chimneys on the inside of the cabins to avoid that raw, half-finished look of other frontier towns. Boulder required that cabin foundations be built within 7 days.
And on the 7th day he rested.
With the entire cabin completed within 60 days, cabins were to be oriented north-south in orderly rows along the public streets. They sold the lots for $1,000.
$1,000?
Yes, a lot of money in 1859, when in Denver they were giving it away.
Why?
Because they wanted to attract a certain type of population, and it has continued to do so since that day. It does create a certain type of community.
This is a picture by the famous photographer Edward Curtis. It's called Arapahoe Maiden.
Although Niwot had moved his camp 15 miles north to St. Vrain in order to prevent clashes with the new towns, trouble comes anyway. It's at St. Vrain on April 14, 1860, that a man named Charles Gardner led a group of drunken whites from Denver to the Arapaho camp.
If we do not hunt, we cannot feed our people. But if the warriors leave the camp...
I really love the late 19th century, but I just find it all so appalling too. You know, when I read old newspapers, the racism that just drips from them and this real hostility, I had an intern looking at some newspapers, and he came across the account in the Rocky Mountain News of April 18, 1860.
The account was a letter to the editor from the famous African-American scout, trapper James P. Beckwourth.
After dark, a lot of drunk devils and bummers went into the lodges, took the Indian women and girls forcibly out, committing acts of violence which in any other country would condemn the perpetrators to ignominy and shame. Age was not respected. The gray hairs on John Poiso's old Indian wife
That's Niwat's sister.
could not protect her.
Which, as I explained some of the Victorian language to the intern, was essentially detailing a mass rape.
This rape would probably have included Niwat's wife and 10-year-old daughter.
The leader of the attack, Gardner, was well known to the Arapaho. He was a big man who had escaped the Philadelphia prison. He had married one Arapaho and then eaten her during a winter blizzard, earning the nickname in Denver of Big Phil the Cannibal.
We returned from a successful hunt to find women who will no longer eat.
This is a picture of Beckwourth, a man trusted by the Arapaho to help them negotiate with the authorities in Denver.
There are no images of the perpetrators.
Why has this sexual and racial violence been obscured?
Even after the attack on the Arapaho women, Niwot refused to let his young men fight the whites. He decided instead to test the Denver criminal justice system.
I cannot let my warriors attack. I cannot even let them kill the cannibal. Denver would use even the cannibal as an excuse to make war with us. I will not give them that. I have 80 warriors left, 80. They have 2,000 with guns, and they're just waiting for an excuse. We will not be taken down because wild dogs have destroyed our camp. For the good of my people, my wife, I cannot raise an arrow. Beckwourth has come to join our cries. He says that the people of Denver will hang the cannibal and all of the others.
The Indians are as keenly sensible to acts of injustice as they are tenacious of revenge. And it is more humiliating to them to be recipients of such treatment upon their own lands, which they have been deprived of, their game driven off, forced to suffer by hunger, abused more than dogs. My advice is that municipal regulations be made preventing the sale of intoxicating drinks to them. And all immigrants on their way here ought to most religiously refrain from giving the Indians whiskey or trading it to them for their horses.
How can we deal with the fact that when the city of Denver met to discuss this, it turned into, instead of talking about rape, it turned into, don't give Indians alcohol, they just do crazy stuff. It was completely ignoring the issue.
The court dismissed the case against Gardner.
How do we deal with this kind of thing in history? If I went to give a talk to, a group of people who are interested in cowboys, Indians, and trains, they couldn't hear it because it would go so counter to what they thought about the founding of Denver. It would turn into, well, I heard that so-and-so was raped by a Ute man, or I heard, So it gets tit for tat instead of acknowledging the pain of the actions themselves. What I do is so incremental. I try to get people to think that history is more than the good old days. I don't want to have people just be miserable, because people will tune out. But there has to be something, to be some way.
Even though the court dismissed the case against Gardner, Niwot kept trying to work within the American governing system.
I tried so many ways of getting the whites to see that the Arapaho could live with them. I took 2 of my warriors to a cabin where the Denver people vote, and I asked for our ballots. They just stuttered for a while, talking about Indian land not being subject to taxation. All of this land is ours.
This is Denver around this time. It's the early 1860s.
The mass rape at the Arapaho camp gave me a better understanding of why some groups were extremely hostile. The so-called peace chiefs a lot of times were like, man, if you're going to rape my grandmother, you can do anything. You're a monster. There's no hope dealing with you.
Many times, I went to the Rocky Mountain News to protest how my people were being portrayed.
Once the editor, Byers,
That's William Byers.
investigated Niwot's complaint that his warriors had been falsely accused of attacking the Adams homestead, the editor discovered
the Indians killed no ox in the neighborhood nor committed any other outrage. Story appears to be fabricated for insurance purposes.
That's the Rocky Mountain News from around this time period.
early 1860s.
Then there was the time that Black Kettle and I used our own ponies to purchase white hostages from some Cheyenne. I myself rode to Fort Lyon with one of these women on my horse.
That's Laura Roper, who was 17 at the time of her abduction.
We had to show their new leader, Winecoop, that we want peace. We are working for peace. As I slipped her off of my horse, they raised their guns to shoot.
Niwot's biographer, Margaret Coel, points out, for an Indian to ride into a white camp with a white teenage girl on his pony and give himself over as a hostage, as Niwot did, was an act of stunning courage.
I went to see a play in Denver. It was powerful, seeing all the whites sitting around me in the dark, quiet, listening. It is so difficult for them to let their tongues settle into their mouths. After the performance, I came up onto the stage to talk about the peaceful intentions of my people and how we could learn to live together.
That's a picture of the theater from around this time. It's the Apollo Theater in Denver on Larimer Street.
The play showing that night was The Lady of Lyon. It was written by Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton, best known for the infamous cliche,
It was a dark and stormy night.
I wrote about left-hand speech in the Rocky Mountain News, April 30th, 1861. Let me translate.
I speak
The chief
English.
said that his tribe still retained their usual and long-standing good feelings toward the whites, and that under no circumstances will it injure or molest the whites. He warned us that the Cheyenne
I speak Cheyenne.
are disposed to be troublesome and fears there will be difficulty. He advises conciliation and every effort to restrain impulsive demonstration against the Cheyenne. He says that the present problem has been brought about mainly by a misunderstanding.
I also speak the language of the Sioux.
He much worries that in the event of trouble, his people will be mistaken for the Cheyenne, as many of the whites cannot distinguish between them.
I told my white brethren, stop talking about making war with my people. We look upon the white men as brothers.
He thinks that all trouble can be avoided if no assaults or wrongs are imposed upon the Indian.
You have come to hunt for gold. Hunt for gold and leave the Indian alone.
The plot of The Lady of Lyon is a standard Victorian melodrama.
Playwright Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton believed that art should be idealized, that realism was not only bad art, but also bad moral teaching.
The last line spoken in the play that night was,
He who seeks repentance for the past should woo the angel's virtue in the future.
4 years later, with increasing Indian raids threatening Denver, Byers writes in regards to the surrounding Indian tribes.
A few months of active extermination against the Red Devils will bring quiet, and nothing else will.
Cut! So in honor of Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton's idea that art should be idealized and realism is bad art, what is the idealized version of Colorado history? What, for example, is the history that people come into the Colorado History Museum wanting to see? The history they actually clap for. Places, please, places. History we want to celebrate, take one. Thank you. History we want to celebrate, take one.
History we want to celebrate. We want to talk about American Indians and essentialize them, to see them as noble people who somehow just went away.
All these statues are located around the Denver Capitol building. This statue is closing era statue.
And right next to that is this real celebration of pioneers, those settlers who came here first.
This statue is called Bronco Buster.
And seldom is
That's the Pioneer Monument, an image of Kit Carson on horseback at the top with figures of a prospector, a hunter, and a rifle-toting pioneer mother with her infant below.
I should add that in the original 1911 version, there was no Kit Carson. The sculptor had kept the monument with an heroic Native American figure, but the people of Denver were outraged, so the sculptor replaced the Indian with Kit Carson.
As for Boulder, I've been looking at statues around here, but I haven't noticed any settlers or cowboys. There was a train. There is a miner. There are a couple of Niwot sculptures.
And the one by the courthouse does reference to the Sand Creek Massacre.
But most of the statues I've seen around here, besides the buffalo, of course, that are everywhere, are the ones down on the Pearl Street Mall of different wild animals.
People love stories about animals.
1870. American hunters begin moving into the plains, killing buffalo at a rate of 3 million per year.
Especially animals like bison, big animals, cougars, elk, lynx, even though those animals in themselves create a lot of ambivalence.
1893. Fewer than 2,000 buffalo remain of the more than 20 million.
You know, what do you do when there's a cougar walking right down your main street? Or what do you do when the elk have taken up residence in your backyard?
1913. The U.S. Mint issues the buffalo, or Indian head nickel, with an Indian's head shown in profile on the side inscribed liberty, and a buffalo on the side bearing the motto, E pluribus unum, or from many, one.
All right, cut. That's a tape. Places for Sand Creek, please. Places for Sand Creek. The Sand Creek Massacre is deeply woven into the founding of Boulder. I asked Modupi Labode why we should remember this disturbing history. I mean, people have worked really hard at erasing it. So Modupi, why bring it back?
I want to have a commitment to living, and to living more honestly. And part of that means acknowledging that I am a part of other processes, some of which I voluntarily participate in, others that I'm born into. And just because you're born into it doesn't make you innocent or pure. I think for me, again, it's that why question. Why are things the way they are? In the US, the dominant paradigm is very much let's forget about it. When people talk about history, they say, that's history, as a term of dismissing things, instead of saying, that is history, and we're not able to do much about it, except remember it.
Could you tell us what happened at Sand Creek?
Well, initially, kind of the short version is that there had been increasing hostilities between the Plains Indians, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and the U.S. military. 1864 had been particularly dangerous and deadly.
My warriors would not listen to me. Our children were hungry. They stole horses. I left my own camp in protest, but it was not my men who were killing whites. It was not my men. We want peace, but my people are starving, and the government will not honor its treaty. Instead, the whites search the plains and kill every Indian they see.
I guess, in order to be balanced, you can try to put yourself in the position of the white settlers who felt isolated and under attack. The Arapaho and the Cheyenne had been disrupting the trade routes. Denver is really isolated. It's 1,000 miles from the nearest town, and in the days before the railroad, you depended on the wagon train for everything. food, supplies, flour, and if the Arapaho and the Cheyenne had burned everything somewhere outside Oklahoma or Nebraska, nothing comes, which makes you jittery. Then you're isolated. The army can't get through. You know, you're kind of on your own.
Excuse me. I know we're jumping into 1864 and Sand Creek, but before we go any further, I do think it's important to note that as early as 1863, Denver's territorial governor, John Evans, had been informed by the U.S. Attorney in Denver that he had a problem with land rights.
Legally, all lands north and west of the South Platte still belong by treaty to the Arapaho and Cheyenne. Let us be clear. Denver, Boulder, and the richest gold districts are officially off limits.
Go! It all culminated in June of '64 when the bodies of the Hungate family, a man, a wife, and 2 little girls, have been found on their isolated ranch out near Elizabeth, Colorado, and they had been, slaughtered. One little girl's throat had been slit so far that her head had almost been taken off. And these bodies were brought to Denver and displayed and riled everyone on. Got that mob mentality going.
Those that perpetrate such a natural, brutal butchery such as this ought to be hunted to the farthest bounds of these broad plains and burned at the stake alive.
The Commonwealth, a Denver paper, June 15th, 1864.
So in a balanced portrayal, you can really understand the fear that's going through the white settlers of Denver. They feel like they're under siege. They have, proof in front of their eyes that Indians will murder whites, and not just white army soldiers, but women and children as well. And there's panic.
A few days after the Hungate murder, a rancher rode into Denver.
Indians are coming! Indians are coming! Hurry your wives and children to safety! They're gonna try and burn this city down! They're gonna kill us all!
Women grabbed their children and ran out of their homes, leaving doors flapping open and curtains moving eerily in the breeze. Men herded everyone inside the sturdiest buildings and stood with guns and axes, waiting until around midnight when scouts came back to report,
"There are no Indians anywhere near Denver. Come on out, everyone. Go on home. Go on home."
On August 11th, 1864, Governor Evans issues a proclamation.
All citizens of Colorado, either individually or in such parties as they may organize, are authorized to go in pursuit of all hostile Indians on the plains.
I went in search of Black Kettle, the great Cheyenne chief who wants peace as much as we do. We gathered together chiefs from the surrounding bands, and together we wrote a letter asking to speak with the Great Father in Washington. Old Man One Eye, once a great warrior, volunteered to take our letter to Fort Lyon near Sand Creek. I myself put the folded letter into his shirt, knowing he would be shot for approaching the fort, but that they would find the letter. They always search our pockets.
This is a transformative moment in Margaret Coel's book. You see, when One Eye approaches Fort Lyon, waving the letter, the sergeant disobeys fort policy and instead captures him and takes One Eye to the commander, Major Winecoop.
That's Winecoop on his knee on the left.
And Winecoop's attitude towards the Indians at this time was similar to those of other leading men in the territory.
The Indian has no rights that we are bound to respect. He is degraded, cruel, treacherous, with the instincts of a wild beast, and should be treated accordingly. Smith!
Winecoop interrogates One Eye with the help of interpreter John Smith.
Did you not know that any Indian coming within range of this fort was certain to be killed?
I knew it, but in all hours of the day or night, in the bitter cold weather and in the storm, our women, our children are scattered throughout the prairies. Fearing the approach of your troops, they fall down and die. There is mourning throughout our entire nation. If the Great Father in Washington had any idea how much his red children were suffering, he'd stretch forth his hands and tell his soldiers to stop.
Did you not fear that you would be killed when you endeavored to get into this fort?
I thought that I would be killed, but that the paper would be found upon my dead body, that you would see it, and it would give peace to my people once more.
The bravery of One Eye so contradicts Winecoop's perceptions about Indian people that he listens deeply to One Eye, and from this moment forward is an advocate for the peace chiefs. Winecoop takes them to Denver, sure that Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington will broker a peace after sitting down and truly listening to these chiefs like he did. That's a picture of the wagons carrying the Indian delegation in Denver.
14th Street between Lawrence and Laramie. Governor Evans' brick home is on the left. It's September of 1864.
I did not go to meet with the Denver chiefs. I sent my brother, Neva, so that I could stay in the camp and keep the peace. One mistake from my warriors could ruin everything. I could not let one man participate in a raid and jeopardize all of our efforts, but it is difficult not to succumb to the cries of our hungry children.
That's the peace negotiation in Denver. That man is the famous Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle. That's his brother, who is also a chief, White Antelope. And that's Neva, Niwat's brother.
Well, Governor Evans told the peace chiefs, okay, if you are not the bands that are disrupting the wagon trains, killing the Hungates, or raiding settlements,
we need you to go down to Sand Creek by Fort Lyon and camp there under a white flag.
My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms and submit to military authority. Go to Major Winecoop at Fort Lyon.
That was Colonel Shivington, commander of the Military District of Colorado, speaking at the peace negotiations in Denver.
So Neva, White Antelope, and Black Kettle,
thinking they would be under U.S. government protection,
go down there by the banks of Sand Creek by Fort Lyon.
October 17th, 1864, Major Winecoop is removed from Fort Lyon to explain his friendly dealings with the Indians.
That's about a month before the attack on Sand Creek.
The new commander, Major Anthony, insists that the Indians turn over all their weapons.
I asked Major Anthony if my men could keep their bows and arrows to hunt jackrabbits and dogs for food.
Request denied!
I signaled my warriors to drop their bows. But then I spoke to the white leaders, loud and in English, so that every white man on the field could understand. We, the Arapaho, submit to this because we will be brothers in peace. So kill me if you wish, imprison me, but I will not fight you. I will not.
The investigation of the Sand Creek Massacre. Congressional testimony of United States Indian interpreter Mr. John S. Smith.
That's him, top row on the left, third from the left.
Washington, March 14th, 1865, under the examination of Mr. Gooch.
According to Colonel John Shivington's testimony, the men under his command included 750 of Colorado's mounted cavalry with rifled muskets and the 100-day volunteers. How many Indians were there?
Around 500.
500. Men, women, and children?
Yes, sir. I think that probably there might have been 60 or 70 warriors who were armed and stood their ground and fought.
Will you state for the committee all you know in relation to Colonel Shivington's attack upon the Cheyenne and Arapaho in November last?
On the morning of the 27th, near sunrise and daybreak, a large number of troops were discovered a mile below the village. The Indians who discovered them ran to my camp and wanted me to go see what troops they were and what they wanted. Black Kettle, head chief of the Cheyenne, was in camp there with us. Some years previous, he had been presented with a fine American flag by Colonel Greenwood. Black Kettle ran this American flag up to the top of his lodge with a small white flag tied underneath it, as he had been advised to do in case he should meet with any troops out on the prairies.
These flag photos were taken by Ray Ramirez of the Native American Rights Fund at the Sand Creek Memorial dedication in 2007.
People from Denver and Boulder signed up now for this little Indian war. The men enlisted for 90 days. After some 86 days, they hadn't found any renegade Indians. So Chivington comes to the conclusion that these renegades must have re-assimilated into the supposedly peaceful bands that were camped at Sand Creek. You can see, if you were really trying to be balanced, that this is just a misunderstanding of epic proportions.
Do you know if Colonel Chivington was aware of the friendly character of these Indians?
It is in my opinion that he was. He was told there were no Indians in the vicinity of Fort Lyon, except for Black Kettle's band of Cheyennes and Left Hand's band of Arapahoes.
Had there been any hostile act or demonstration on the part of these Indians?
Not in this band.
Do you know the reason for the attack on the Indians?
I do not know any exact reason. I have been told that this whole Indian war was brought about for selfish purposes. Colonel Chivington was running for Congress in Colorado, and it is my understanding that he had this war in view to retain himself and his troops in that country to carry out his electioneering purposes.
Major Winecoop's lieutenants are still at Fort Lyon, and they try to stop Chivington.
Colonel Chivington, we cannot attack these Indians. It would be murder. The men and I that have served at Fort Lyon have an obligation to house these Indians. Major Winecoop pledged his word as an officer and as a man to them, and all of the officers under him are thus indirectly pledged as well. You cannot ask us to fight the very same Indians that saved our lives, as we all feel they have. You cannot! You cannot!
I believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians that would kill women and children. And damn any man here in sympathy with the Indians. Such men as Major Winecoop had better get out of the United States service!
It's the fight itself that really throws this balanced portrayal out the window, because when the first cannons fire on Sand Creek, all the chiefs come running out, carrying American flags and white flags.
George Bent testified that Black Kettle stood holding the flagpole and called on the screaming women and children to gather under it, but that when the soldiers finally got within 50 yards, they opened fire. Reports differ on the death of Cheyenne chief White Antelope. One witness said he joined his brother Black Kettle under the flag, and then, when the shots began, he screamed for his people to run as he yelled at the soldiers to stop. He then returned to his teepee and came out firing until he was shot down. In George Bent's testimony, on the other hand, he mentions no gun, but that White Antelope, seeing his people falling at his feet, chose not to leave the dying, but stood there, his hands folded at his breast, singing his death song until he too was shot down. Reports say that Chief Niwot, although seriously ill at the time, ran towards the charging troops with his palms outstretched in a sign of peace. But he was shot down despite his pleas in clear English. Another member of Boulder's Company D at Sand Creek reported hearing an Indian yell at him in English,
"Come on, you damn white sons of bitches! Kill me if you're a brave man!"
That Indian was thought by some historians to be George Bent.
That's George Bent and his wife. George Bent was the son of William Bent, an owl woman.
There's a couple of letters. 2 officers who held fire. They didn't allow their soldiers to participate because they said this was a massacre. This was, I'm a soldier. I fight, not kill people. And in some of the letters that the soldiers wrote back, they talk about some of the ways in which the genitals were taken, in which children were killed, and so on. So it's kind of interesting how initially some people have just said, oh, it was all just oral history, meaning that it came from American Indians, therefore it's suspect. But it was kind of interesting how people haven't been able to argue that when you had soldiers of the U.S. Army saying this was completely unmilitary activity.
Were the women and children slaughtered indiscriminately, or only so far as they were with the warriors?
Indiscriminately.
Were there any acts of barbarity perpetrated?
Yes, sir. I saw the bodies of those lying there all cut to pieces. Worse mutilated than any I ever saw. The women cut all to pieces.
How cut?
With knives, scalped, their brains bashed out. Children, 2 or 3 months old.
Did you see them when they were mutilated?
Yes, sir.
By whom were they mutilated?
By the United States troops.
Commanding Officer Colonel Shivington's perspective was
kill and scalp all Indians, little and big. Knits make lice.
So it's at that moment that all the balance flies out the window. You know, Shivington initially said, oh, there were some 500 warriors there. We defeated in a valiant battle. But what I find amazing about Sand Creek is this is November of 1864. We are in the middle of the Civil War. Sherman has just marched from Atlanta to the sea. Grant is bogged down out there outside Washington, D.C., losing 1,000 men a day in the Civil War. And in this, Abraham Lincoln stops Congress and calls a congressional investigation into Sand Creek. So even the whites of the time recognized that this was an atrocity. One man who refused to fight was arrested because he, shirked his duty. He refused to fight. His name was Captain Silas Soule.
That was Silas Soule, the man right there on his knee next to Wine Coop. According to the men on the field, he actually begged Shivington, a friend and fellow abolitionist, to stop the assault. And when Shivington rallied his troops forward...
Fire! Stop! Stop!
Get him, boys!
Silas Soule disobeyed military authority and ordered his men...
Don't move!
This allowed some of the Cheyenne and Arapaho to escape.
When Soule got back to Denver, he stood up to threats and agreed to testify against Shivington for the congressional inquiry.
3 attempts were made on Soule's life before he was finally gunned down in the streets of Denver.
Many of the participants in the massacre are some of the founders of Boulder, Denver, other places. The Colorado Historical Society has a house that was owned by the Evans family, and the Evans family later became, over generations, one of the most powerful and wealthiest in Denver.
Company D included Boulder's original founders, who were first welcomed by Niwot: Thomas Aikens, Fred Squires, and A.A. Brookfield, who also became Boulder's first mayor, as well as Marinus Smith, the man who donated most of the original land for CU. The leader of Company D, David Nichols, the man credited with getting CU for Boulder, boasted that it was he that had brought down the great Chief Niwot.
Company D did not include Niwot's friends in Boulder like Bob Hawk, who prayed that Niwot had somehow escaped.
At an exhibit on Sand Creek at the Boulder History Museum, it talked in detail about the mutilations at Sand Creek. The Colorado Volunteers went back to Sand Creek the day after the massacre and cut off toes, fingers, scalps, ears. They cut off women's breasts and men and women's genitals and tied them to their saddles.
They cut off White Antelope's nose and ears, and then he was scalped and castrated.
They went back the next day and completed the mutilations the next day.
Following a performance at the Denver Opera House a few days after the massacre, members of the 3rd Colorado Regiment jumped up on stage, parading their Indian scalps as the audience cheered.
When Colonel Shivington was asked about the mutilations, he said,
"The soldiers were simply obtaining trophies to preserve as reminiscences to bequeath to their children of the glorious field of Sand Creek."
But what I find amazing, now, Colonel Shivington was a Mason. He belonged to the Masons chapter of the Union Lodge here in Denver. About 4 months ago, I was asked to give a keynote talk on the founding of Denver to the Masons. And I gave basically the same talk I just gave you. The outrage of some of these men that I would assume that Shivington had acted inappropriately. The man was, after all, a Methodist minister. How could I assume that he would commit this atrocity? Oh, and remember, the Indians were at fault too.
In Colorado, there's alternative historiography that's kind of grown up. That there were warriors in the camp, that it wasn't a massacre, that it was a full-fledged battle. That in some ways the Indians deserved what they got. This has been a very active scar, a very active, painful thing.
The people who are still members of the Masons Lodge are descendants of the founding fathers of Denver. To make it look as if Shivington were wrong would make it look as if their ancestors were wrong.
So Judy, there you are, a guest speaker hired by the Masons to hopefully tell them what they want to hear, and you tell them exactly what they don't want to hear. How do you handle that type of situation?
You listen. I'm a firm believer that I can't change people's minds. People have to change their own. But maybe something I say will add something to the opposing end of the scale that might ultimately change their mind. You know, it wasn't all of them that wanted to lynch me. Just a few.
Hello?
The issues of karma are so complex. I think it was Ajahn Fuang who once said, insight comes down to seeing your own stupidity. You keep doing the things that you don't have to do, but they create suffering for you. And not only for you, but also for the people around you. And you keep on doing it again and again and again. That's the definition of stupidity. We don't like to think of ourselves as stupid, but we are. When you finally develop the equanimity to admit your stupidity, when you can step back and learn how to unlearn all those stupid actions, that's where insight shows its benefits. It can teach you to fashion things in a new way, a better way, so that your participation in shaping your experience, your participation in the world around you, gets more and more skillful.
Thank you for watching alongside us. And now let's take a few breaths together as we breathe and commit to being part of creating a future that acknowledges this history of genocide and moves toward a future where Indigenous rights are honored. And now, poet Tanaya Winder offers a poetic response to this history we just witnessed in the film.
The ghosts of your past are calling to reach you. The spirits of your future are calling to greet you. Both are asking you to make amends. Both are telling you you play a critical role in how this all ends. I want to believe all the things I learned in school. I learned in school that nothing about Indigenous history or perspective was going to be given to me in those history books. I learned from those books that all Indigenous people had no hair on their arms. I learned then that something must be wrong because that didn't apply to me. I learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America. I learned that Native Americans gave Europeans the first Thanksgiving and fed those in need. I didn't read about any kind of atrocity. I want to believe all the things I learned in school, that we all get access to the same things, and if we work hard, we get the American dream. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. President of my class, student council, band, sports, waitress. I remember putting up signs in the hallway for my sister running as student body president. The sign read, Fry Bread Power, referencing a movie that was the first I'd seen for us, about us. But our principal and school board, which to this day is still 100% white, told us to take them down. We were being racist. I tried to say we were celebrating. Do you know what it's like to finally be seen? I thought if we worked hard, we got the American dream. I went to Stanford and saw my peers dressed as Pocahontas, making a mockery of things I held sacred. I learned about mascots and more about the cartoons, TV shows, and movies that relegated us to the past, frozen in time. I traveled the country, met college-educated people who said, I didn't know you all were still alive. Met folks who asked me if we still live in teepees, who asked, why isn't your skin red? And I wonder why they wanted to make us disappear. It's no wonder why we're invisible. The ghosts of your past are calling to reach you. The spirits of your future are calling to greet you. Both are asking you to make amends. Both are telling you you play a critical role in how this all ends. They made us disappear into Reservation, into cartoons where our skin is red. They forced us into boarding school, stole our food, anything to make us dead. It's hard to learn the whole history, harder to hear the truth. It hurts to hear about our people being murdered and raped. Hard to read books where I learn how much my people trusted yours. It hurts to read about our villages and camps being burned with loved ones inside. It's hard to read about white Indian agents keeping food so we die from starvation. It hurts to hear about the land being taken, mined, pipelined, and desecrated. It's hard. It hurts. It's hard. It hurts, but these traumas are passed down in you and me. These traumas exist in the air we breathe. If you don't want to remember, no, we can't forget. If you don't want to remember, no, the land never forgets. We need to remember. Our ancestors need us all to do better. If you're asking why it wasn't me, I'm asking you to open your eyes to see. If I can deal with my anger, you can deal with your shame. We both have to find ways to deal with that pain. The ghosts of your past are calling to reach you. The spirits of your future are calling to greet you. Both are asking you to make amends. Both are telling you you play a critical role in how this all ends.
Thank you, Tanaya. We now turn to Margaret Coel, the author of Chief Left Hand, who will share with us a few words on why it's important to know this history.
Thank you. I've seen this movie on a number of occasions, and I saw the play as well. And every time I'm just sort of struck dumb by it. It's so powerful and so hard. It's hard really to watch. It's hard for us to have to face our history and to have to face the truth. There's such a strong connection to Boulder, between Boulder and Sand Creek, because Captain Nichols, he was designated captain by Shivington, so for whatever that means, but in any case, he organized the Company D of the 3rd Colorado Regiment. And these men who were in this company, who were from Boulder, they knew Left Hand. They knew him. Many of them knew him. They had met him. He was very comfortable being around white people. And because he was so fluent in English, and he had grown up with his sister having married a white man, John Poisson, he had grown up with a white man. And that's how he had learned to speak English from Poisson. But he was comfortable around them. And he would come to Boulder. He loved Boulder. he would bring his band to Boulder to camp every winter. So of course, that's a big connection with Sand Creek right there, and that the band that was at Sand Creek had lived in Boulder. And he also got to know many of the ranchers around here, or the people who were, setting up ranches on Arapaho and Cheyenne, legally Arapaho and Cheyenne land. And among them was the rancher Bob Hawk, who ranched out by Niwot. He would actually go and stay with Hawk, and they would visit, and he wanted to talk to him to try to figure out how to deal with these white authorities, Governor Evans and John Chivington. What kind of men were they? How was he going to deal with them? How was he ever going to work out some kind of accommodation with them, whereby his people and these tremendous numbers of white people coming onto the plains could live together, could accept each other as human beings who could just live together in peace. And so he would go and actually stay with Hawk. He would spend the night at the ranch and stay with him, and then be on his way the next day. When Chivington came to Boulder to confiscate horses for the attack on Sand Creek, he took 6 horses from Bob Hawk. Hawk had no choice but to let him take them because Chivington had the guns. But Hawk refused to join the Company D with Nichols. Unfortunately, there were too many other ranchers who had known Left Hand who did join. And when they went to Sand Creek, it was the third company, the Company D, the third of the 3rd Regiment that actually attacked the Arapaho camp. So it was Nichols, this rancher here in Boulder who had known Left Hand, who led the attack on the Arapaho camp, and then bragged later that he had brought down the famous Arapaho chief, Left Hand. So that is a pretty sorrowful and striking and horrible thing to think about, that these people who knew Left Hand, who had seen him and his people here in Boulder, who had seen him with his family, that they couldn't see him and his people as fellow human beings. And that is what is shocking, just shocking, I think, to us today. I'd like to point out something else, though. There were good people. It's just that their voices were just not heard. They were not listened to, but there were good people at that time. And among them was Bob Hawk, who said, "I'm not going." Edward Wynkoop, who had a huge transformation when he saw One Eye come into Fort Lyon bringing this letter, knowing he was going to be killed, but knowing that he was doing this for his people. Wynkoop was so taken by this, it totally changed his whole attitude toward the Indian people, because for the first time, he saw them as human beings, as fellow human beings. Wynkoop did all he could to prevent the attack on Sand Creek, and Chivington had him removed from Fort Lyon, where he had been the commander, had him removed from Fort Lyon and sent to Fort Riley in Kansas to get him out of the way, because Chivington feared that he would stop the attack, which Wynkoop would have done his best to do. There was Silas Soule and Joseph Kramer, 2 of the officers with the 3rd, who held their troops back, who said, "This is a massacre, this is an atrocity," and told their men to stop, and did that at the very risk of their own lives, because they would have been shot. Chivington would have shot them himself, or certainly had them shot for not obeying orders, but they did it anyway. And then, of course, later, Silas Soule was murdered in Denver before he could testify against Chivington. So there were people like this, and I think we have to try to bear that in mind when we reflect on what happened 156 years ago today, the horrible atrocity of Sand Creek, that there were people who were speaking out for what was right and for what was good and for what was decent. And I think we have to remember that. And today, when we look at where are we today, and how do we deal with racism today, and how do we deal with this problem this attitude of not accepting people who are different from us, other people as human beings. I think it's important to reflect back that there were good people back even in that horrible time, but there were so few of them and their voices weren't loud enough and they weren't able to stop what happened. And so we have to really, I think today, to encourage the people who think who think that people who are different from us are nevertheless human beings, who recognize that. We have to always encourage those voices and work hard within ourselves to remember that people who are different are nevertheless human beings. And we have to respect that, and we have to, allow them their rights and certainly the justice and all that is due to them as human beings. So I think that's about all I have to say for this. But again, I think what a really moving movie. It really kind of takes your breath away.
Thank you, Margaret. We know you're probably all wondering what ongoing Indigenous rights work looks like. So up next is Dallin Maybee, who will talk to us about the work of the Native American Rights Fund. And after he speaks, we will move into a Q&A with Dallin, Margaret, and Tanaya. So make sure you have your questions ready.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. It's sometimes these conversations can be very difficult because they deal with very difficult narratives. It was interesting to hear how there was an alternative narrative about what occurred at Sand Creek. I am Northern Arapaho. I'm from Wind River Reservation, or my mom's tribe is from Wind River, but my dad is Seneca from Western New York. And I've heard varying narratives about our history and how we came to be in Wyoming, and it's all very fascinating. Luckily, I work for an organization, the Native American Rights Fund, that still gets to tackle some of the challenges that Indian country, as we like to call it, faces. What's interesting about the Sand Creek incident and that massacre is the people just simply wanted to live according to their cultural identity, according to their life ways that they knew, their traditions, the things that grandfather or creator or man above, however you address him, had given them so that they could simply be happy, right? Part of that was this Colorado territory, this Boulder area, where they got to see this fullness of beauty. And a lot of people ask us, well, what kind of work is NARF doing? And our fight is actually the very same as the fight that Chief Left Hand was fighting for his own people. They just simply want to live according to their cultural traditions. And that's what we want for all 575 federally recognized tribes. That's what NARF is fighting for currently. We have a set of priorities. We're a 50-year-old organization that really was established on the heels of one of the larger civil rights movements back in the 60s. So in the early 70s, board members decided that there was a set of priority areas where we should focus our legal work and litigation and programming. It involves a lot of fulfillment of treaty obligations, environmental rights, and sacred site protections. Just simply the ability to live according to whatever tribal client we have, their traditions. So whether that's a water fight for sovereignty and stewardship over salmon, for example, in the Pacific Northwest or up in Alaska, or whether it's simply a treaty obligation fight anywhere else where they treated with the United States. NARF is there to take those kind of fights on. A lot of it has to do with the strength of our voice. 100 years ago, the strength of our voice was not as amplified as it could have been. It was often just simply an individual like Chief Left Hand approaching his friends and allies and trying to figure out how to be heard. How would they enforce these treaty obligations? A lot of people don't understand that treaties were the supreme law of the land right next to the Constitution. And when we conceded great swaths of land or natural resources in exchange for education or a land base that would be protected or health, we did so fully expecting another nation as great as the United States to live up to those obligations. But here we are 150 years later, and unfortunately we, again, are still fighting some of those same fights. This is definitely a conversation that could go on for quite a while, but I would definitely invite you to visit our webpage, www.narf.org, to really get a glimpse of some of the casework and programming that we engage in. Because it's casework and programming that isn't just affecting tribes and tribal nations, it's also affecting our neighbors, whether it's a pipeline going across state land and eventually crossing traditional territories of tribal nations. It's the same fight. If it's going to adversely affect and impact the watershed that these tribal nations depend on, its chances are going to affect your waterways and watersheds as well. So I'm grateful for the warrior cultures that have come before us to really give us a model of not only how we can really embrace the ways in which we can develop allies and really get back to this idea that Margaret shared, that we were human beings first. If you go back far enough, you could probably find tribalism in every culture. I had a chance to sit down with the poet John Trudell, and we were just kind of chit-chatting about the state of affairs in Indian country, and this topic of tribalism came up. And he's like, I don't even self-identify with my tribe anymore. I am a human being first. At the end of the day, I am a human. I have to take care of my brothers and sisters, and it doesn't matter what tribe they're from. And I found that very compelling. It was a wonderful example. It definitely shifted paths for me and how I approached some of these issues that I like to address as a native, as a Seneca, as an Arapaho, and really just get back to the foundation that we are all human beings first. Some of these fights are not our fights, but they probably should be. And so, I invite you to definitely figure out how you can engage with us, support us, whether it's financial or volunteering. One of the first steps is just simply educating yourself about an alternative narrative, an alternative perspective. I don't think any of us are here to change anybody's minds, as it was mentioned earlier. We just simply want to open people's eyes to all the ways that we can engage together as human beings.
Thank you, Dallin. And now we have time for a short Q&A with poet Tanaya Winder, author Margaret Coel, and NARF representative Dallin Maybee. One question that is popping up, we'll start with, what happened to Chivington?
Chivington went on to live his life. He left Denver for a while, but he did come back, and he was appointed, I believe, postmaster in Denver. So the thing about Chivington is that he got out of the Army before the military held an investigation into Sand Creek. There were 3 formal investigations held by the government into Sand Creek. One of them was held by the military. All of them condemned the actions of Chivington and the actions also of Governor Evans, condemned them. Had Chivington still been in the Army, enlisted, he would have been court-martialed and possibly punished for his role in Sand Creek. But as it was, he had mustered out of the Army, so he was outside of their control. But as I say, he went on, he lived his life in Denver until he died sometime in the 1890s, I believe. At one point, the daughter of one of the men who was killed at Cheyenne, man who was killed at Sand Creek, met Shivington at an event in Denver. Her friend brought Shivington over and said, "I don't know if you know Colonel Shivington." And this woman drew herself up. I believe she was Cheyenne. She drew herself up and she said, "I should know him. He killed my father." But Shivington, until the day he died, he defended what he did at Sand Creek. So that's what happened to Shivington. Nothing, basically.
Thanks, Margaret. There's a lot of questions popping in, so I'm going to go with one over here, which asks, is living on a reservation for a time a realistic way to really befriend Native American people? Reading books is not enough.
Tanaya, are you? Do you want to tackle? Okay. I don't know how realistic it is, unless perhaps you marry into the tribe or become close enough that the tribe would make space for you, more or less. But there's simpler things that you can do. You can engage in some of the events that are open to the public. There's always these intertribal powwows that you can go to and see. Not necessarily they're separate from our ceremonies, from our spirituality, but it is a chance to just engage, eat some good food, see some dances that do have a foundation perhaps in ceremony and stuff, but it varies widely from tribe to tribe. Some tribes, like the Pueblos, they have, holy smokes, a huge schedule throughout the year from any of these 21 Pueblos or something, where you can go and see them performing their dances. But other ceremonies are very much closed to the public. They are meant for that tribe, and of course you should respect the tribe and those wishes. But it's all about involvement. Denver has a rather thriving Native community that you can go and participate in a number of events and a number of powwows and just kind of make friends and cast a little bit of a net and see where it goes.
Thank you. Tanaya, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say it's what someone put in their comment too about, there are documentaries you can watch as well if books aren't enough. And just like visiting when it's safe to do so again. Like some tribes have really amazing museums that are interactive and offer some of those teachings. But in pandemic times, get creative, like reach out to a nonprofit or a Native arts organization and say, hey, I want to help. I want to learn, like, can I host an event? Or like, can I even if you're like, hey, you got 4 artists, I'd love to host an event, can pay them to do a performance. And that way it's like an exchange, like they're getting something for their time. But I feel like you can learn a lot from like filmmakers or musicians, like people just sharing their stories as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions that are actually asking about the current sort of state of being of the city of Boulder. One is asking, has there been any discussion about establishing a memorial or other commemorative structure on the former Fort Chambers site, which the city of Boulder purchased recently? And there's another question around hearing that the city of Boulder was working with the Arapaho to put proper signage up around Boulder about Native history. So really, does anyone know sort of what is currently happening around some of these efforts?
I know a little bit. We do have an exchange sister city sort of relationship with Boulder and Longmont area, and it's been complicated. I won't mince words. We do have as part of our traditional religions and ceremonies, we have these 4 old men who are the spiritual caretakers of some of our sacred objects and things. And I have heard that they have visited the area, that they're working with the city to talk about how to best appropriately manage, the opportunity for tribal peoples to use some of these sacred sites again, maybe to have sweats or pipe ceremonies and things. But the pandemic sidelined quite a bit of that. And so I'm not sure what the state is exactly and where we are at. I'm hoping to get involved, and we'll see kind of where we end up. Margaret might know a little bit more about that, actually.
Actually, I only know, what I read in the paper is what I know, but I find it really encouraging. It wasn't that many years ago when generally the people here in Boulder had no idea that this had been Arapaho land, that the chief left-hand and his people had lived here at one time. They had no idea. And now people know that. There is that awareness. And there's been a relationship established with the people on the reservation, on the Wind River Reservation, and even with the Southern Arapahos in Oklahoma. They have come to Boulder as well. So I think that I find this really hopeful and really encouraging that we're beginning to face reality and face our history and incorporate it into our present. So I think it's what I see and what I read about happening is just all good.
Thank you. I would love for Kirsten Wilson, our artistic director, to pop in from Techland, where she's at, and perhaps you can answer some of the questions around the film and what kind of responses or actions have we seen stimulated from its work, as well as another question around whether this is part of school curriculum yet.
Hello, from Techland in Motus Theater. I'm not sure why I'm not popping up if you guys can hear me. Okay, you can see me, great. I live in Techland. But the main thing is, yes, there's a whole curriculum that was created around Roxkarma arrows. There's actually a film featuring the founder of NARF, John Echohawk, Margaret Coel, and there's some of the great leaders in Boulder discussing the history in this film and how it relates to present day. And all of that was woven into a curriculum piece for schools. I know there's a teacher at Casey who's currently using this performance in her Colorado curriculum. Often we find out about it later. A lot of CU professors use it within their curriculum. But it's available for school use, and it fits within all the pieces that need to be dotted for curriculum components. So if you know teachers out there that you think would be interested in using this film, we have a lot of aides that would be supportive of that. And then following up in terms of impact, there's been a lot of impact from Roxkarma arrows. Over 2,000 people saw it, and many of them city leaders. Modus is always very strategic about encouraging people who have the ability to make policy changes to our performances. And so Ray Ramirez, for example, from the Native American Rights Fund, emeritus, he's now retired, but he credited Motus Theater's Roxkarma arrows with part of the momentum in terms of Indigenous Peoples Day. The great county commissioner who's just stepping down, Deb Gardner, saw this piece and decided after she saw it that she would commit herself to diversifying boards and commissions, and she worked tirelessly until she had momentum on diversifying boards and commissions. There's been a lot of other things. There's actually there's a scholarship that was done in this name. A lot of people made personal contributions, whether it was getting involved with how they can share computer and technology resources and things in Boulder with the Wind River Reservation. So there's been a lot of actions that have been taken from it, and the main thing that keeps us going and sharing this piece is one of the things that people said is like, aren't you, did this knowing this history, does it make you want to leave Boulder? And what we find is the more people know about their history, the more of this area that we walk on every day, the more meaningful the land is and our relationship to it. And so we just hope that you find out about one of the best assets in our country that happens to be up on Boulder, which is the Native American Rights Fund, because they're doing tremendous work on Indigenous rights, and with that becomes tremendous work on environmental rights, and with that tremendous work on human rights, out of which all of our humanity and the value of our humanity and our children's humanity is at stake. So I think that was the questions.
Thank you, Kirsten. I see a lot of other questions also around the history and some of the storylines. So for example, did the murder of Mr. Sewell ever get caught? And if so, what happened to the murderer? As well as during the time period where those who took an active part in things like the Sand Creek Massacre and the mass rape beforehand, were they commonplace? Did society actively punish, shame, and keep an eye on such people?
The murder of Silas Sewell was never solved. It's an unsolved murder. He was killed right before he was supposed to testify at one of the hearings on Sand Creek, and he would have testified against Shivington. So, you know, you can look at who had a motive to see that Silas Sewell did not ever appear before one of the commissions. What was the second part of the question?
The second was a sort of a different thought around, were those who took an active part in things like the Sand Creek Massacre commonplace? Did society punish them?
Society did not punish the people who took part in Sand Creek. In fact, society at the time honored them. Denver honored them when they returned. Boulder honored them when they returned. And so you have like Downing Street. Downing Street in Denver is named after one of the men Jacob Downing, who was one of the leaders of Sand Creek. So you still have the Evans, you have Mount Evans, named for Governor Evans, who was really the brains behind Sand Creek. So these people who took part in it have never, you know, they just went their merry ways. And in fact, they were honored for what they did. And that's a huge black mark on our history, I think.
You can actually, you know, with a relatively easy Google search, find various massacres of peaceful encampments and villages throughout, you know, the U.S. relationship with tribes. It wasn't long after that the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred in 1890, and 20 medals of honor were given, and it was essentially a carbon copy of Sand Creek. They mutilated bodies. They attacked a village where the warriors had gone off to hunt. It was a village that had nothing to do with these perceived slights that and this give and take in an ongoing war. They were just looking for somebody to blame, and it cheapens the Medal of Honor by, even though it happened historically and it was, I hesitate to say commonplace. It's a shame that you can essentially commit war crimes as viewed today. Even historically, they should have been viewed as war crimes and award them with the Medal of Honor. And so there are movements taking place to strip those people of their medals of honor for the actions at Wounded Knee. I'm not sure if any were given for Sand Creek or anything, but you know, we can right some wrongs. We can make a few strides. You know, there's racial slurs for certain mountains and things that can be changed. We can remove the name. We could remove statues of genocidal maniacs like all those steps are steps to right historic wrongs, and that, yes, they should have occurred in the time of our ancestors, but here we are We can make those steps now, even though we weren't the ones who committed those atrocities. What's right is right. It's fairly simple.
I think the very fact that we're discussing this and that we're asking these questions, what happened? Why were these people never brought to justice when they should have been? I think that just shows within the human heart, there is just such a longing for justice, and that these people who took part in these atrocities were honored and instead of condemned, which is what they should have been, just grates on us. It's just wrong.
Definitely. Thank you all. And I know there are so many more questions that everyone has that I wish we could get to, but perhaps one of the ones that I see coming up most is what actions can we do now, right? Like what happens moving forward? So Dallin, can you close us out by sharing any key action steps our audience can take? And after that, Tanaya Winder will deliver her powerful poem, Resistance, to encourage us all to take action to support Indigenous rights.
Yes, absolutely. This conversation that we're having now around racial equity and social justice, it isn't just ours. There's an African American community, an Asian American community, a Muslim community that needs allies. We need people who are willing to take the first step, which is usually educating yourself a little bit about what some of those issues are, and then finding out how to personally engage. For some of us, it's showing up at a march. Maybe it's direct action. Maybe it's just simply a financial contribution to a cause that resonates with you. You'll often find that we do have similar challenges. If you want to protect water, find those organizations that are actively engaged in protecting water. There's no one simple solution for how we can best solve every problem that we're going to see in these racial equity challenges. But a lot of it is just simply being aware and making a first step, be a friend. Should I keep going?
Not unless you don't want to.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Tanaya Winder now with the poem.
All right. So I wrote this poem actually when Standing Rock was happening. Just really feeling for our people and wanting to be there to help, but just not being able to, because my role here, working with the youth I work with, and just literally coming to that moment thinking like, where is my body best served? Like, where is my physical presence best served? Like going there or staying here. And so I wrote this poem because I just felt like I wanted to do something. So it's called Resistance. Noun. 1, to exert oneself so as to counteract or defeat. 2, to withstand the force or effect of. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? And the concussion grenades, red glare, water cannons bursting in freezing air temperatures, rubber bullets shot at water protectors gave proof to the night that America is still spelled with 3 Ks. America, a word that starts with an A turned upright like pointed white hoods saluting the settler colonialism. Ism, a dangerous definition or doctrine of discovery buried in the highest court of the land supreme. Supremacy of the free, home of the brave braves who became animals upon discovery. But you cannot discover a people who already existed, and you cannot find something that was never lost. Even an Indigenous Holocaust couldn't get us written about in history books. Our numbers may not be written on arms, but you can count the amount of headstones from children buried in Indian boarding schools. America thought we died there when they cut our hair, stabbed our tongues into silence, pried our mouths open into singing anthems of freedom in English. A language America force-fed down our throats like a pill called assimilation, telling us to let go of all that we hold sacred. like our connection to the land, by moving us onto reservation, into desolation, a symbolic annihilation so deafening today people forget we exist or that we are real. Never seeing beyond the painted faces of Washington, redskins. This corporate-colored red skins our identity and bleeds in a country built on the backs of brown bodies, genocide and slavery. What do those stars and stripes represent when those in power won't honor our treaty rights? Whose rights when we all have a right to survive and be free, to live, to drink clean water and not build walls around these man-made borders? When history is written by colonizers, they are always the heroes. Colonizer made from colon, body politic, a black snake swallowing everything, a black snake swallowing everything, a black snake swallowing everything. When they're drilling in the name of money and killing our water and soil in the name of oil, and our sisters are being stolen, and the holes we dig in the earth mirror the holes we keep digging in ourselves, we keep digging in ourselves. And who can tell what is the real truth when alternative facts are birthed in a colonial womb? But the revolution will never be won through patriarchy or held in the fists or lips of patriarchal men, but it will be born from women who know how to carry movements in the womb of intertwining lives. The revolution will be birthed from women who know that deliverance and delivery come from being ripped open in an unstoppable force that reminds us our most powerful weapons will always be giving life and a body in prayer that stands up unafraid to speak. Can you see me? Can you see us? When you sing, oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free? You have the right to remain silent, but you also have the right not to be.
Thank you. Thank you all. And on behalf of Motus Theater, we do want to thank Modus's powerful contributing artists, including Motus Theater's artistic director, Kirsten Wilson, the creator of Rock's Karma Arrows, and poet Tanaya Winder, as well as our guest speakers, author Margaret Coel and NARF representative Dallin Maybee. In the chat, you can find the opportunity to donate to Motus Theater and the Native American Rights Fund. We cannot work with people on the front lines of violence in America or present programs that encourage conversations about immigration, racial injustice, and violence within the criminal justice system and our local history without your support. So please consider making a meaningful contribution and scheduling your Colorado Gives Day gift today to Modus and NARF. Thank you for contributing to our important work. And that is it for today. Thank you for coming together to learn this important history so we can create a new, more equitable future. Those of you joining us on Zoom will have your emails added to our mailing list so you can join us in future performances, including part 2 of Rock's Karma Arrows. With heart and gratitude, have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Tanya.
Solcito mío, solcito,
bye, everybody.
Solcito mío, solcito, solcito, solcito mío.